live. Today is the 21st of March 2024 and I am reading out of Lord of the Horizon. We are continuing with Ra-Ab, who is here 21 also. In the Eyes of Horus, he was one of the main characters. This is a Joan Marshall Grant far memory book about her life in the ancient Egypt. We're continuing here with chapter 6, Nome of the Jackal. On the day that Amenemhet completed the first year of his reign, a daughter was born to Kias. And a few days after receiving the news, Mary and I went to visit her in the Jackal. When Mary told Hanuk how greatly the baby resembled him, I was amused to see him display the same self-conscious pride as I had felt for Ameni. Kias treated the baby as though it was a puppy, and I noticed that she had chosen a nurse who would never attempt to oppose her wishes, as Niam frequently tried to oppose Mary's. After spending 3 days at their house of the Nomarch, they took us on a progress through the Nome to show us the improvements already effected. "We have not yet so many priests as you have," said Kias, "for although the old Nomarch never permitted set worship, he had very few real priests. Most of them were men who repeated the ritual prayers to Ra in complete sincerity, but they could make no real link with the gods. Yet they were kindly, and since the people were fond of them, we are letting them continue in office until sufficient new pupils are initiated." "How many pupils are there?" 20 training to be healers, 3 whom the priest of Ma'at expects to pass the 2nd degree of seership within 5 years, 5 who follow Anubis, but who may take several years before they pass their final initiation, and 1 who is rapidly developing the faculty of far memory. Father is very excited about her work, for she may be able to fill some of the gaps in his records. It seems that she has been on Earth during periods in which he is especially interested. He agrees with me that far memory is the only really accurate way of knowing the past, for a papyrus, however faithfully scribed, gives only the bones of history and not its living reality. "We are building a temple," said Anuk, "or rather enlarging one already in existence. But you know that already, for you have seen the plans. We followed your example and built in plastered mud brick instead of in stone, for it is so much quicker and less laborious for the workers." "Are you having much trouble with the people who were deprived of office at the dawn, and yet who were not bad enough to be sent into exile?" "Some of them have been rather difficult," said Kias. "We found that many of them were too frightened to speak freely when we received them in audience. So Hanuk had the excellent idea that we should both act privately as temple counselors." "That's a very good idea," I said, "and one which we might well follow should the need arise." "But you don't need to, for the people of the Oryx aren't afraid of the Nomarch. Even those whom the Watchers condemned are learning not to be afraid of us. But you can't blame them for being a little apprehensive at first. It's so difficult to make them understand that we are not punishing them, but only trying to cure them of their being unhappy. Hanuk, tell Ra-Ab about the overseer you saw yesterday." "He was a man whom I knew had been for a long time taking bribes, and unless the people gave him what he demanded, he used to threaten them with whipmen. That, of course, was before the dawn. Yet I think he was only corrupt because he considered it a legitimate prerequisite of his office. And so you must have been amazed when on the day Kias and I returned here as Nomarchs, one of his own goat's herds came to his house and to say that their positions had been reversed. He thought the man was mad until he saw that 4 soldiers had been sent to see that the order was carried out. When I explained to him that he had been deprived of his right to collect taxes only because he had shown himself to be unready for temptation, he wouldn't believe me, and remained convinced that the change had been made solely to humiliate him. I assured him that just as the previous goatherd had risen to the rank of overseer, so should he rise if he showed himself to be more valuable to the community in a wider role. He went off grumbling that he had been wronged, yet in less than a year his herd has doubled. His wife makes the best cheese in the Nome, and his daughter is such a good milker that it is said she could persuade a sphinx to give a copious yield. Yesterday I offered to reinstate him, but to my surprise he flatly refused my offer. He said that he hoped in a few years to earn the title of keeper of the Nomarch's herds, and that if I wished to do him a favor I could barter for a foreign ram to improve the strain. Did he give no reason for his remarkable change of ambition? Yes, he did. And I had to admit that he was justified. He said that under the old rule, everyone wanted to gain wider and wider authority because the higher their rank, the fewer people there were whom they need fear. Since fear has lost its hold, a man is free to seek contentment along the path best suited to his talents. People are no longer divided into overseers and those who have to obey them, for they know that they are all threads necessary to the weaving of the pattern. He said to me, "While I was an overseer, my wife never enjoyed having guests to our house, for if they were of the same rank, they disliked us as rivals, and if they were less important than ourselves, they hated us because they were afraid. Now that she is the wife of a goatherd, she knows that the people who share our food do so only because they value our friendship. So I'm most fortunate, for I enjoy good company, and my wife has turned out to be a better cook than she who once served me, and I no longer have to worry lest my daughter's husband should choose her only because he hopes for advancement." Having so small a priesthood, said Kias, means that we have to undertake some of the duties which would normally be theirs. For instance, we've had to decree that the nomarch has power to pronounce a marriage at an end. Now that the Watcher's 3 grades of marriage have been introduced, there will soon be little need for the exercise of this authority. But there are still a lot of problems left over from the old rule. So many people seem to feel guilty because they are not happily married. It sounds very unlikely, but it's quite true. We always see the man and the woman separately before giving judgment. Sometimes they both feel guilty, and sometimes each blames the other. And I've often heard people say, "We used to love each other, but somehow I feel quite different to what I did 5 years ago." It is a very terrible thing to admit, but I've changed. Then they say it is as though change and betrayal were 2 words for the same thing. We explain to them, and sometimes it takes a great many words before they believe us, that all living is constant change, and that without change there can be no growth. I said to a woman only recently, "If you lost the power to change, your soul would be stagnant. Think what would happen if even your body was no longer influenced by the growth principle of Ptah. You would soon be bald, for your hair would cease to grow, your skin and nails would wear away because they could not renew themselves, and soon the bones would pierce through the flesh that was shriveled and decayed. What an unpleasant prospect! Yet you wish that your soul should cease to grow. Only those who fear to change pluck out the first white hairs, or see tears in the eyes under which wrinkles begin to appear. To fear growth is to fear age, and to fear age is to fear death. Do you fear the beauty of the sunset because you do not believe there will be another dawn? Do you shut your eyes to the stars because you fear that Ra has forsaken Earth forever?" She thought for a moment before replying, and then said, "It is easy to talk like that when you are still young, but wait until you are as old as I am, with your children nearly grown up, and neither you nor your husband want to have any more. Then you will ask yourself why he should stay with you when he could find a younger wife to please him." So I said to her, "If I were offered linen from a weaver, but but recently apprenticed, or linen from a weaver of 20 years' experience, which do you think I would choose for my tunic? Have you learned so little during your 15 years of marriage that you need fear competition from the inexperienced? Is there so little friendship between you and your husband that you must rely only on your body for a link to hold you together? Has your companionship proved to be so much less pleasant than he hoped? She said reluctantly, "He has always been good to me in his own way, but he is lazy unless I scold him, and at festivals he has a great thirst for beer." "Did you scold him so much before you were married?" I asked, and she exclaimed, "I thought you said you were married. But you can't be if you ask such a foolish question. No woman scolds a man before she is married. For one thing, she doesn't want to, not having found out how tiresome he can be at times, and for another, it might turn his eyes to someone else." I pretended to be very surprised and said, "What a pitiable thing is marriage, for it appears that it can turn a smiling girl into a shrew, and a desirable man into an idle drunkard. But let us pretend for a moment that you and your husband are two people who set out to climb a mountain together. It is steep and smooth as a pyramid, save for a long flight of steps wide enough for two to walk side by side. Perhaps after a time he grows weary. If you go on alone instead of waiting until he is rested, is it surprising that soon you can no longer speak to each other in ordinary voices, but have to shout, and that the words are often carried away by the wind? Or it may be that you become weary of the climb and seek another road, forgetting that the mountain is so steep. When you leave the steps, you slide down the smooth slope, unless the other, who has still a firm foothold, stretches out a hand to help you scramble back to safety. Perhaps you forgot to stretch out a hand when your husband stumbled, and even mocked him for sliding downhill. Or was it he who was proud that he could climb so much faster than you? The one who leads must always help the other to follow, and the one whose foothold is secure must always help the other who stumbles. If they do not, their progress is slow, for life is a journey which cannot well be undertaken without a dear companion." She said grudgingly, "I suppose you mean I ought to have more tolerant and not so quick to notice his faults?" That I have been more tolerant and not so notice his faults, and I answered, "It would have served much the same purpose if you had appreciated his virtues. Either he has virtues, or else you were a fool to be so deceived in his character, for surely you were too pretty not to have had the choice of several men." She said indignantly, "I was a pretty girl, not that you'd believe it to see me now." So I told her, "Beauty changes not in degree, but only in kind, unless you refuse the gifts of the years. A baby has its own kind of beauty, but if, when it becomes a girl, it is still bald, still has such short legs that it can't suck its toes in comfort, would the girl be considered beautiful? What is suitable to one age would be a mockery if it did not grow into another aspect of beauty. Why do you deny the value of maturity? Would you forego the pleasures of a grandmother just because you are bitter that you are no longer heavy with your first child? A woman who sorrows because she is no longer young is as tiresome as a child who always wails for the toy which is out of reach. For 60 days I want you to try to rejoice that you are no longer young and foolish, to remember that, although your husband is free to take another wife, he will not wish to do so if you take as much trouble to please him as you did 15 years ago. If after those 60 days you find there is no longer a link between you, then your marriage shall be decreed at an end." "Did you find that your people were willing to accept the Watcher's law of marriage?" asked Mary, as Kios finished her story. "It wasn't such a startling reform here as it probably was in other gnomes, because many of our people have kinsmen in the Oryx, and have seen for themselves that it leads to happy marriages. The only people who grumbled against the new laws were those who have long been unhappy in their family life. They seem to think that through enduring misery they acquire merit, and that they will somehow have been robbed of their right to a reward unless the next generation goes through similar unhappiness. Hanuk and I found that as a useful guide to character is to ask people whether they approve of the new marriage or the new laws which decree that a parent must relinquish all authority over a child unless that authority is the product of mutual affection. It is surprising that most people are so much more proud of their ignorance than they are of their virtues. You never hear a woman say, "How meritorious I am to have stayed with my husband for 20 years. And I did so because I loved him, and should have been miserable if we had been parted from each other." Yet they frequently boast of having continued to live with a man they dislike. "That's going to be one of our most difficult problems," said Mary, "to convince people that there is no merit in misery. They must be taught to fight for happiness as we fought for the dawn. Real happiness, not the temporary anodyne of self-delusion. Happiness is never negative. It can only be achieved by an effort of will." "It's not as easy as it sounds, Mary," I protested mildly. "To be happy, you have got to canalize your energy into the right channels. For a man who loves the soil to become a linen weaver would be to throw away his happiness. For a woman to have a child if she's not by nature maternal might be misery, yet her sister might find barrenness a terrible deprivation. We shall have to modify the caste system before men are free to follow their talents. The son of a fisherman should not be expected to be a fisherman, nor the warrior to be the father of warriors." "But in the Oryx they don't have to," said Mary. "No, nor do they in other gnomes. Yet the tradition is so strong that only the most virile characters ever rebel against it." "Why did the man Hanuk was telling us about become an overseer?" "Because he was the son of an overseer. By a fortunate chance, or perhaps in calling it chance, I underrate Hanuk. He was made a goathead, and for the first time in his life was happy. No one must expect their children to follow of necessity their own example." "I shall remind you of that," said Mary, "if Amenemhet shows no talent for being nomarch." "I shall be sorry if you have to remind me, for I hope that parenthood has not robbed me of all understanding. If as a drawing scribe or a fisherman he would find better soil in which to grow, I hope I shall have the charity not to starve his talents." And turning to Piers, I asked, "What do you hope for your daughter?" "That she shall be lucky enough to find her Hanuk while she is still young." Her husband smiled down at her. "If she resembles her mother, then indeed he will have cause to be thankful to the gods." So that was the end of chapter 6. And the chapter 7 is entitled Summer Palace.